So in part one, we certainly hit home the importance of carbohydrate for training and sports performance. However, one argument that we have not put forward yet is carbohydrate omission or low carbohydrate availability, training and or competition. And we're going to explore that in part two. Before we do that though, one important topic which we need to understand is this mechanism of carbohydrate and fatigue. So as mentioned earlier, we have our blood sugar levels which like to be between 4 millimoles per litre and 7 millimoles per litre. Anywhere between these two markers is considered a stable blood glucose level, and we like to keep between these two figures because it provides a nice healthy source of glucose that can be delivered to skeletal muscle as and when is required, but also it keeps our brain working efficiently. Now, what happens when we get a carbohydrate feed, for example, and we've eaten a carbohydrate rich source, then our blood sugar levels, especially if it's a high glycemic carbohydrate, will rise, and this is what's known as hyperglycemia. So we've gone above that 7 millimoles per litre. Now here, this might be a positive thing in terms of sports performance, which we've just talked about at length. But what happens here is that during this hyperglycemia state, we get a release of this hormone known as insulin from the pancreas. And what that does is that's tasked with reducing this amount of blood sugar in the bloodstream back down to a nice stable level. So this insulin will therefore take any blood sugar, glucose molecules, to skeletal muscle, for example, if it is required. Now, when the glucose gets taken into the cells, it will be used, and then we will get a nice, hopefully, a nice healthy normal range again. However, let's say, for example, we're on that roller coaster ride from a high glycemic carbohydrate, plus the fact that we've used a lot of carbohydrate in a short period of time for exercise, for example, then we might get what's called hypoglycemia. So this is when our blood sugar goes below that 4 millimole mark. And what happens here is that when we are at this hypoglycemic state, then we might start to feel hungry, we might start to feel irritated, we might start to feel tired, and also in terms of exercise performance, we may get a lag in our ability to express strength, power, speed, our RPE may go up. Everything we spoke about before, this might be attributed to low blood sugar levels. Now, this is not what's known as hypoglycemia, and when this occurs, we have a fail-safe which is put into place from your pancreas. Now, your pancreas will release a hormone known as glucagon. So when low blood sugar level is identified, the pancreas releases glucagon, which is a hormone, and it tells the liver, which may have stored glycogen in it, to release some of its stored glycogen into the bloodstream. And this way we can top up our blood sugar levels again once more to a stable level. Now, our body loves to be between this 4 and 7 mark because this is where our brain and our muscles function most efficiently. And as you can see here, just to show you what blood sugar levels do in terms of the way that we feel in our physical condition, this is some data taken from the 1924 Boston Marathon, and it was testing blood glucose levels in runners before and after the race. And as you can see, if we take a look here at some of the hypoglycemic states, for example, this person here was at 2.7 after the race had finished, and their physical condition was very poor and irritable. We have somebody here at 2.8 that was actually looking pale as a result, and someone as low as 2.5 had a very poor condition and was almost in a shock-like state. So again, this just goes to show that when we're in this hypoglycemic state, the body doesn't like to be there, and as a result we may feel some not very nice physical impacts from that. Ultimately, what it's all about is just to try and keep your blood sugar levels at a nice stable level, and we can do that through carbohydrate feeding or from having adequate muscle glycogen stores. But what about when we run out of those stores, and what about if we don't feed carbohydrate? Is there an ability to maintain these blood sugar levels for what's known as a euglycemic state? So that's between 4 and 7 millimoles. And we're going to look at a process called gluconeogenesis now, and how when we don't feed carbohydrate, our body has this mechanism by which we can preserve blood glucose levels. Okay, so let's delve deeper into this process of gluconeogenesis, and let's put the context of low carbohydrate availability. So this may occur, for example, during the closing moments of a game or an event, and we're running low on carbohydrate, or we may not have even fed carbohydrate or had high carbohydrate stores prior to an event or prior to a training session. So what is it in terms of the mechanism which your body has got to guard against this? And you may remember when we were talking in the protein lecture, I did say that carbohydrate is actually the only non-essential macronutrient. And what we mean there is that we could go the rest of our lives without eating another carbohydrate and our body would be just fine, because we have this mechanism of gluconeogenesis where we can manufacture glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. Now, I've already identified that carbohydrate is of course very important for sports and exercise performance, but from a health standpoint, from a practical standpoint, you literally could not go another day without eating carbohydrate and you would survive just fine. That's not to say that I'm advocating it, however. So we're going to look at now the processes by which occurs from these non-carbohydrate sources. And the first one is from our amino acids. So we don't necessarily store protein, but the biggest reservoir of protein is of course in our skeletal muscle. And we have two glucogenic amino acids, meaning that they can be easily transformed into glucose, and these are known as alanine and glutamine. And these two glucogenic amino acids can be, in extreme circumstances, used for fuel to generate glucose molecules. This may occur during fasted training, this may occur when we've not eaten a protein-rich meal, or, like I've said, during the latter stages of exercise or sport performance. Fat. Now, we have a huge amount of calories that we can use for fuel in the form of fat. And when we do the fat lecture, you will understand that a fat molecule, which is known as a triglyceride, contains a glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids, hence the word triglyceride. Now, glycerol can be cleaved from this triglyceride, and glycerol can be used again to manufacture carbohydrate or glucose molecules. And then lastly, lactate. Okay, so when we mentioned the metabolism of carbohydrate at the beginning of this lecture, we mentioned that lactate wasn't necessarily the enemy in terms of muscle acidosis, and it can actually be used as our friend rather than a foe. So lactate can actually be used to manufacture some of these glucose molecules, and all of this will take place in the liver. And the liver has over 500 functions. One of them is to produce glucose from non-carbohydrate sources in this process of gluconeogenesis. So what happens is these non-carbohydrate sources that we've just spoke about will then be delivered to the liver. Glucagon, which lets the body know about low blood sugar, will also control enzymes in which to produce pyruvate, and pyruvate will then be turned and phosphorylated into G6P, okay, and then that will be broken down into glucose, and then eventually that will be transported out of the liver by a glucose transporter known as GLUT2, and then will be delivered back into the bloodstream. And this may be one of the mechanisms by which blood glucose or stable blood glucose levels can be maintained. So hopefully what's clear here is that yes, carbohydrate is an important factor for sports performance. However, the body does have mechanisms in place or fail-safes to protect you from low blood glucose levels should you be in a low carbohydrate availability state. And this is something that leads nicely into our next bit, which is going to be the topic of nutritional periodization. So, do we always want to have high carbohydrate availability based on the studies that we've looked at so far? And whilst they are important for sports performance, there may be some interesting data regarding low carbohydrate availability and the impact of that on adaptation and also for future sports performance. So, what is nutritional periodization and how can it have an impact on adaptation? And that's what we're going to delve into now. So, if you just read that subtitle there, a lovely quote from James Morton in 2014, stating that nutritional status can be the determining factor of whether training adaptations are augmented or attenuated. This really is one of the key reasons why I'm so interested in sports nutrition. From that, the nutritional intervention that you actually put into place can have a profound effect on the outcome of an exercise training session and therefore the adaptation ultimately which is achieved over a long period of time, whether that be 8 weeks, 12 weeks or 6 months or 1 year. You as the nutritionist can have a genuine impact on the adaptation that your athlete or your client has. So, as we've mentioned, in context of exercise performance, carbohydrate is king. Carbohydrate feeding and muscle glycogen availability plays a huge role in our ability to express force and to perform for long periods of time without fatigue. However, one concept which has recently come to fruition in sports science is the concept of low carbohydrate availability. In terms of responses that we might see from this, we can look at the bullet point list here and we get an increase in lipolysis. So this is the breakdown of triglycerides from fat cells. They can then be carried to the mitochondria for fat oxidation or fatty acid oxidation. So we are literally burning more fat in a low carbohydrate state. And as mentioned before, we get some protein kinase and gene expression from this. And because we're in a low carbohydrate availability state, then there is a master regulator known as PGC1 alpha, which basically encodes for more mitochondrial biogenesis. So through training low, we may be able to impact our aerobic capacity and our skeletal muscles' ability to grow more mitochondria. The additional benefit of training low in terms of a low carbohydrate state is it may help with weight management. So the boxes that you can see in the background of this picture, of course they have to make weight, and therefore training low may offer some advantages in terms of adaptation for aerobic capacity, but also may mean that we can reduce the amount of calories that we consume in order to help a weight making effort. On the flip side, of course, something we've already spoke about is training high. So this is the concept of deliberately training with high carbohydrate availability. And this obviously determined by the training intensity which is required. So we know that training at higher intensities or exercising at higher intensities requires carbohydrate availability because it preferentially uses carbohydrate for fuel during those high intensity bouts, and also when we need a higher amount of training capacity, so our ability to go for longer without fatigue. Now, this of course is advantageous because we're going to be able to reach higher exercise intensities and we're going to be able to exercise for longer. So this may be beneficial for important sessions or sessions which are going to require high intensity efforts. Not only that, when we train high, we increase our ability to metabolize carbohydrate. If we go too low for too long, then what may happen is our skeletal muscles' ability to use carbohydrate as a fuel will actually decrease over time. So this is important in terms of nutritional periodization, that we don't just take one of these strategies and then apply it to every single aspect of our training. We can take both strategies and apply it when we need it. As mentioned, during a train low session, this may be, for example, a fasted run in the morning where training intensity isn't required or isn't too important, and we can just get a long steady state run or cycle or row in first thing in the morning, and we can get some of these advantages. A train high session, if we're, for example, training 2 times a day, might mean that in the evening we have a strength conditioning session which is high intensity, or we have sparring, or we have sprints, something along those lines where high intensity efforts are going to be required, and therefore we can make sure that our athlete or our client goes into that session with high carbohydrate availability. The key thing here, okay, is that we need some information in terms of which nutritional intervention to employ at the right time. Depends on a number of factors, and that might be the aim of the session, the intensity of the session, how long that session is going to last, okay, and the importance. Do we require skeletal muscle force and increased time till exhaustion during that particular exercise training session? And if the answer is yes, then the answer might lie within one particular strategy over another. And this really is the concept of nutritional periodization, in that we periodize the nutrition to meet the requirements of the program or the exercise training session to bring about better adaptations over a long period of time. Okay? Now, it's not just train low and it's not just train high that can be used as strategies. There are also strategies such as sleep low or recover low, where we go to bed with low carbohydrate availability, and we may implement some of these adaptations that we talked about before. They may be expressed during sleep low states. By the same token, we might recover low, where we don't feed carbohydrate after a training session, and therefore some of these adaptations, these gene expressions from the protein kinase and PGC1 alpha, may increase mitochondrial biogenesis. So it's not just about going into training sessions with low carbohydrate availability. We can also use some of these other strategies and employ them as and when we need it. So in order to start laying out carbohydrate needs, I suppose what we need to understand next is carbohydrate utilization during performance. And from the picture there, you can see that every sport has a very different demand in terms of the physicality of the sport and the muscle fibers that are used, the movement patterns and so on. And so therefore that's going to need a different carbohydrate feeding strategy. And I suppose the next thing to look at with regards to that, and to try and understand and better put a intervention together, is to look at muscle glycogen breakdown rates. So this is a fantastic study done by Saltine and others in 1974, and what they looked at was the impact of exercise intensity on muscle glycogen breakdown. Now, hopefully what's clear already is that exercise intensity at higher percentage of VO2 max is going to use more carbohydrate for fuel, and of course at lower exercise intensities, a lower percentage of our VO2 max, there's going to be a predominance for burning fat and therefore less carbohydrate used as fuel. But in terms of actually being able to put a feeding strategy and genuine amounts together to better inform your client and to better prepare your client, we need to look at how quickly this muscle glycogen can actually be broken down and used and therefore depleted. So if we look at VO2 maxes which are at 150% of our maximum VO2, so this is super maximal intensities, all out sprints, really high intense work, and you can see the steep curve by which muscle glycogen is depleted in a very short period of time. And in fact, around 10 minutes worth of 150% of VO2 max intensity, we've pretty much depleted all of our muscle glycogen. But then if we look on the flip side and we look at a VO2 max percentage of 31%, we can see that muscle glycogen has a much more steady depletion rate, and in fact even after nearly 3 hours worth of exercise there is still over half of the muscle glycogen used or still remains in the skeletal muscle. And that might of course point towards fat being used as substrate and the dual fueling process of carbohydrate and fat being used together. Now of course, since this study there's been further exploration into muscle glycogen breakdown and utilization during sports performance, and one particularly interesting area of research looks at the fiber type utilization. So depending on the type of activity that we do, and therefore whether it's aerobic or anaerobic, will determine the muscle fiber type that is used. And there is some interesting data out of Liverpool John Moore University that looks at certain exercise intensities which will only break down glycogen from type 2 or type 2X muscle fibers. So depending on the type of activity that we do will determine the depletion rates in certain muscle fibers. Not only that, repletion rates can also be encouraged or predominant on muscle fibers that we have used. So for example, if we do a high intensity interval training session which has innervated type 2 muscle fibers, then not only will I deplete those type 2 muscle fibers preferentially in terms of glycogen depletion, but also when I come to refeed carbohydrate, they will be repleted preferentially before type 1 fibers. So I suppose that the type of activity that we do is going to be an important factor in terms of muscle glycogen depletion, but also muscle glycogen repletion. And of course that's going to be down to your training stimulus that you put on your client and what you expect from them from any exercise training session. Now whilst all this science is fantastic in terms of a starting point, of course we're not going to have tools such as muscle biopsy analysis or the new innovative measure of ultrasound which can be used to measure muscle glycogen in the last couple of years. We're not going to have these materials available to us during a gym session for our client. So of course this only provides a starting point which again you as the practitioner will have to play around with as you get to know your client and get to know your individuals on a week-to-week basis based on the way that they perform during sessions, the way that they feel, the feedback that you get from them, and so on. So one thing that I do want to provide are just some practical take-home prescriptions based on the narrative that we've been talking about so far. And that narrative is related to the early studies about filling up muscle glycogen stores, and then also the inauguration of nutritional periodization in recent years and the benefits that we can get from going low carbohydrate availability depending on the type of session, the aim of the session, and so on. And this is a new concept really with regards to fueling for the work that's required in regards to carbohydrate ingestion. We don't need to have a filled muscle glycogen storage in order to get the most out of our performance. And these two studies, along with many others in the scientific literature, have really made that point clear. This first study here by Hargreaves and colleagues looked at peak power output on a cycle ergometer, and what they found was regardless of whether clients or participants had 25% of their overall skeletal muscle glycogen or 80% of skeletal muscle glycogen filled, there was no significant difference between the peak power output of either group. In this study here, it was looked at time until exhaustion and low carbohydrate versus high carbohydrate group, and what was found was in terms of short-term intense exercise, the time until exhaustion, regardless of muscle glycogen availability, didn't differ. However, if this was repeated sprints over a longer period, of course the amount of muscle glycogen that was stored may begin to play a part. Now what this leads into is the new coined term within carbohydrate And the topic of carbohydrate in sports science is fueling for the work required. We do not need to fill up muscle glycogen stores, and therefore all the calories and energy that comes with that, especially when we start to talk about body composition impacts and also the impact on weight making efforts, for example in combat sports, we may not need to fill up muscle glycogen to their absolute 100% peak levels in order to get the performance benefits. So if we look at the early prescriptions from the start of this lecture, you looked at 10 grams per kilogram per day, we may be able to reduce that. And again, this is completely dependent on the type of athlete you got, the demands that you put on them in terms of their day-to-day training. So we may only have to fill muscle glycogen up to around 50% in order to get the performance increments from a training effort. So hopefully what we've done so far is at least provided the framework or a foundation, or at least a starting point for which you can implement carbohydrates for training and competition, or of course you can omit carbohydrates for certain purposes. One place that I encourage you to start is this fantastic journal which was written back in 2011 by Louise Burke and colleagues with regards to carbohydrates for training and competition. And what they provide is at least some of the prescriptions that you can put forward in your day-to-day nutritional programs for your clients based on the goals that they have. And you know, this was really one of the first studies which started to prescribe actual amounts of carbohydrate targets for different athletes. And of course since then, which was 9 years ago now since it was written, there has been plenty more research articles that have looked at carbohydrate prescriptions and then how that can be manipulated in order to bring about a better response for a specific goal or target. So that's it for part 2 of this nutritional lecture series. If you pop over now to part 3, we're going to look at the macronutrient fat. So see you there. Goodbye.